Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Boardroom Forum Live. In this new series, we will be talking about responding to ESG reporting requirements. Today, specifically, we will be covering which current and future requirements are relevant to my entity and to my business. My name is Jeshla, and with me today, I have Julie Rosa, an expert in our sustainability field. In recent years, there has been a significant surge in sustainability regulations and frameworks, both locally as well as internationally. These changes have had a profound impact on businesses in South Africa, shaping their strategic, operational, as well as reporting perspectives. So before we get to any questions and how important this is for companies, Julia, perhaps it would be useful for you to assist us in all the different terminology. This is just confusing, even for someone like myself who has some idea around sustainability. We talk about reporting frameworks, global goals, rating agencies, and the list just goes on. So perhaps a bit of clarification about that before we really get into the crux of the matter?
Yeah, sure, Joshua. It is very confusing and actually also quite easy to simplify. So there's a lot of different acronyms. We call it the terminology swamp, but really we have reporting frameworks, and what reporting frameworks are there for is it's a structure and a way for companies to identify what they should report on, how they should report, and to really tell their story and be transparent and accountable to stakeholders. So an example of a reporting framework would be something like the GRI, SASB, the TCFD, which are the climate standards, and it's really a structure. Then we have the rating agencies. So the rating agencies serve a very specific purpose. They are there to rank and to score the performance of companies in terms of their environmental, social, and governance, and they also look at it from a risk perspective. And often investors would use those ratings. So they have a very specific role. And then we have the global goals, such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They were aimed more at a national and a global level, and they set out the ambitions and the goals that countries and businesses need to aspire to. And the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are kind of the best example of that. It's a shared vision, and it really is about not leaving anyone behind and about progress for a sustainable future for all. And then the last one is really the regulations. So regulations are generally legal or regulatory, enforced by a regulatory body, and they're mandatory. So in South Africa, we have adopted a voluntary approach, but the EU has taken a regulatory approach, and in the US, there also are regulations, the SEC regulations that are not yet out, but that will be out fairly soon.
So recently, I read a very interesting article around two rating agencies that rated the same entity on almost completely different, gave them completely different ratings. How does that work?
So the rating agencies have different methodologies, and typically the company would provide the information to the rating agencies to score them on those, to be used in the rating and the scoring. So it would just depend on the methodology and what the rating agency is looking at.
Okay. So why is reporting so important for companies?
So reporting is how companies tell their story, how they articulate their narrative, how they demonstrate what they're doing, how they, different stakeholders want different bits of information, and reporting is a way of bringing that all together and telling the world really what you're doing from a sustainability perspective. It's very important for companies. It builds trust with stakeholders. Investors use it. It builds investor confidence. It can be used for risk management because in the reporting process you can identify the risks which can then be mitigated through that process. So it serves many different purposes.
I guess ultimately it leads to better decision making as well.
Exactly, spot on. Yeah. That's exactly what it does.
So there's a lot happening on the global front around regulations. Not so much so we've heard in South Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about the regulations?
Yeah, so the South African companies are impacted by regulations in the global arena. So the EU is probably leading the way in terms of regulation. So they've come up with their Fit for 55 package, which includes many different regulations, but the one that is particularly relevant for reporting is the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And as part of that Fit for 55, it's to drive accountability and to drive disclosure. So companies in South Africa would be impacted because if there's a lot of companies that could be impacted depending on whether they're a subsidiary of an EU-listed company, whether they have operations in the EU, or whether they're in the supply chain of an EU-listed company. And that means that they need to report in terms of those disclosure requirements.
So it's quite far-reaching impact for South African companies as well, although the regulations are not in place in South Africa.
That's right, yeah.
So Julie, you've told us about the fact that this impacts companies in South Africa. Perhaps can we go into a little bit more detail around how this impacts companies in South Africa?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing that's really important for companies to and organizations in South Africa is to work out whether they're in scope of these regulations. Do these regulations actually apply to the organization? And if they do, in what way? Because they're different categories. So firstly, in working out whether they are in scope, one would look at, are they a subsidiary of an EU-listed company? Do they have operations in the EU, or are they in the supply chain of the EU, of a company that is listed in the EU? So the sort of reach of these regulations is much bigger and much broader than anything we've seen before. In fact, more than 50 times more companies will have to report in terms of these regulations.
So the impact is far-reaching.
Yeah, the impact is far-reaching. So once a company has determined that they're in scope, then they would need to understand what do they actually need to report on, how is it actually going to affect them from a strategic, an operational and a reporting perspective.
Okay.
So in order to determine what they need to report on, one would then look at the principle of materiality. So in South Africa, we're very familiar with the principle of materiality, and the JSE has a double materiality principle as well as the EU requirements. So double materiality is a way of looking at impact materiality. So how does an issue actually affect the organization? And then the financial materiality. So what is the financial impact of that? And in this materiality assessment, it's a great way of really understanding the risks and also the impacts for your organization from a sustainability perspective. And then once we have identified the material issues, you would then know what needs to be reported on from a data perspective.
Okay. Just in terms of materiality, are you finding that companies in South Africa are getting this right in actually getting to the materiality that is the correct measure?
So we're seeing a lot of uptake in the materiality space at the moment, and in particular around double materiality. Okay. So companies have always, well, let's say always, but typically, conducted materiality assessments, but it hasn't always been the double materiality. And then also because there's been a lot of changes globally post-pandemic, various other different issues that have sort of shaped the global economy. It's always good to revisit your materiality.
Sure.
So to look at it every couple of years and to make sure that you haven't missed something out, or that something that was material that is no longer material would then fall off the materiality matrix.
And I guess we have changing circumstances every day, so
exactly.
we need to look at it all the time.
The pace of change, it's just so rapid at the moment. Yeah. So and the materiality assessments, we find that it's a great eye-opener for the leadership team as well as the organization. It shapes your reporting, it really makes it relevant, and you can address your stakeholders and your stakeholder issues in a really great way with a good materiality assessment.
Okay. So you spoke about data. Data is very relevant in all in everything we do these days. From a reporting requirements perspective, what does this mean from a data perspective, I guess?
So data is really, really important. And it's important because companies need to have the data to report on, but the data also needs to be accurate, and it needs to stand up to any sort of possibility of greenwashing accusations. So it's important for them to tell their story, and also to be able to make sure that what they've reported on is actually valid. Investors and the broader stakeholder community would look at the data to actually understand and to determine progress. So data is also a way of understanding your baseline, setting your targets, monitoring, and really demonstrating progress in your sustainability journey.
So I guess again the question is, how do you find organizations doing from a data perspective currently? Are they getting that right? Are they finding difficulty in that?
It's an area where there are a lot of challenges. You know, sustainability and ESG are very broad. So you've got sustainability data sitting all over the organization, data from supply chains that would need to sort of be collected. So it's an area where we are seeing a lot of focus and a lot of interest from companies in really getting their data right, the data diagnostic, and being able to demonstrate progress and to make sure that they don't have the risk of greenwashing. Greenwashing is essentially when you make a sustainability claim or a statement, but you don't have the data to substantiate it. And that's even been extended more broadly now to rainbow washing. Okay. So rainbow washing as in covering more than just the green, the E. So in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, there, one could look at rainbow washing with that lens. So data it's very, very important. I can't really sort of overemphasize that.
Yeah. Perhaps in conclusion, if what would you say are sort of the three main areas, or what would you want the listeners to walk away from today's discussion?
So reporting is very important. It's the way that you communicate, tell your narrative and your story to your stakeholders, and including your investors. That knowing what to report on is extremely important. So materiality, definitely the cornerstone of really good reporting, and then making sure that you have the data that supports what you've said from a reporting perspective. And those are really the three key takeaways.
Okay, thanks, Julie. I think in conclusion, that was useful for all our ESG experts out there, or even our professionals in ESG. I guess just to reiterate then, it's reporting is very important for companies. Companies need to know what to report on, and the data used is really key. Thank you once again for listening in, and see you next week on the next episode. Thank you.